Okay, we can go. I'm John Scahill. I'm Biological Secretary of the Society, and it's my pleasure to introduce the members of the panel to you tonight. Before I do, could I just make sure that you switch off your telephones? There aren't any planned fire evacuations tonight, so if the alarm goes off, it's for real. And you go out that way. There's one over there, I think, or this one here, and there's one where you came in at the back. And also it turns out that the event's being webcast tonight and recorded for the Society's archives. So as far as you're concerned, that means that you stay close to the to this thing when you're answering questions and when you're speaking. Okay. The chair for tonight's event is Dame Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer for England and advisor to the UK government. The Chief Medical Officer position is independent and advises the government on all medical matters with particular responsibilities regarding public health. Sally has been involved in the NHS R&D since its establishment. As Director General, she established the National Institute for Health Research, which has a £1 billion budget. She was awarded a DBE in the New Year's Honours List in 2009 for services to medicine, and in May 2014 she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. To the right of Sally is Professor Neil Ferguson. Neil's a senior investigator of the National Institute for Health Research, a fellow of the UK Academy of Medical Sciences, and received an OBE for his work on the 2001 UK foot and mouth disease epidemic. He uses mathematical and statistical models to investigate how infectious diseases are formed, their evolution, and their transmission. His recent work has focused on the use of models as contingency planning tools for emerging human infections, including Ebola, pandemic influenza, bioterrorist threats, and livestock outbreaks. Next, we have Melissa Leach. Melissa is Director of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She's a social anthropologist and has 30 years research experience in the Sierra Leone, Guinea, Liberia border region on issues of health, environment, science policy, and gender. In 2014, she co-founded the Ebola Response Anthropology platform. Next to her is Professor Chris Whitty. Chris is Chief Scientific Advisor and Director of Research and Evidence at the UK Department of International Health. He's Professor of Public and International Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Consultant Physician at the Hospital for Tropical Diseases. His background is as a clinical epidemiologist working on diseases of poverty in Africa and Asia. And finally, we have Professor Jeremy Farrar. Jeremy is Director of the Wellcome Trust, a global charitable foundation, as you all know, dedicated to achieving improvements in health by supporting the best research. Before that, he was director of the Oxford University Clinical Research Unit in Vietnam, where his research interests were in infectious diseases, tropical health, and emerging infections. Jeremy was appointed OBE in 2005 for services to tropical medicine, and he's been awarded the Memorial Medal and Ho Chi Minh City Medal from the government of Vietnam, Frederick Murgatroyd Prize for Tropical Medicine by the Royal College of Physicians, and the Bailey Ashford Award by the American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. So that's tonight's panel, and I'd now like to ask Sally to come and start it off.
Thank you very much, Sir John, and thank you also for introducing the starry cast. I'm delighted to be here kind of facilitating this. So what I'm going to do is give a very brief history of Ebola and this outbreak. Then each of our speakers will give up to 10 minutes of discussion in a key area. Neil is going to talk about causes and modelling, the numerical epidemiology of it, Melissa about the spread and the cultural factors, Chris about the response of the UK government and others in Sierra Leone, and then Jeremy will focus on vaccines and novel treatments. And then we can have a conversation starting between us, because there are things that we may disagree or want to talk about, but then opening up so that all of you can get a chance to join in, so that we can have a worthwhile evening for all of us. So clearly I'm going to come on to the current outbreak, but Ebola is an RNA filovirus. It was discovered first in 1976 in Zaire, and the strain that we've been looking at in West Africa is that same strain, Zaire. It was actually discovered by two groups, but the most important one to us is, of course, Peter Piot was a co-discoverer, who is the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And they first found it in a Belgian missionary hospital, where they discovered that the nurses were passing it between them, partly because of poor public health, sanitation and hygiene, and reusing syringes. And what they also found was that other villages around were self-quarantining, isolating to try not to catch it. So some of the initial stories were there right at the very beginning. The fact that there was an 88% mortality rate, that people died towards the end with diarrhea, vomiting and bodily bleeding. And actually I want to emphasize that while people are incubating this disease, which takes anything from 2 to 21 days, they are not infectious. It's when they become symptomatic, and only then from their bodily fluids, whether it's their blood, because you've taken a blood test, or other bodily fluids, particularly diarrhea and vomiting. At the same time, quite independently, there was another outbreak at the time in Sudan, and we've had in total 7 outbreaks until now. So that clearly, for researchers, raises the question, where is this coming from? And we know there is a reservoir in bats and probably in gorillas and chimpanzees, so bushmeat. And you can catch it from their feces. It's presumably catchable from eating them, but or handling it before eating it, and there may be other ways as well. And this particular outbreak, which occurred not in East and Central Africa as the previous outbreaks, occurred in West Africa. And that perhaps shouldn't have been a surprise, as we know where the bat population is, and that they are the animal reservoir. And in a lovely piece of detective work, we know that the index case was a child, Emile Omuono, who developed it in December 2013 in Gwekadu in Guinea. And that is actually on the borders, as no doubt Melissa will explain, of Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, that border country. And it spread amazingly. It spread to his family, and everyone except the father was killed. And then it spread into the healthcare sector, killing those in Gwekadu Hospital and spreading to Macenta Hospital and the doctors brothers and everything there. So it spread. But, and one of the things I think we will between us reflect on, as it grew and spread in the different countries, there was a delay in a global response. So it was only declared a public health emergency of international concern by the World Health Organization, the WHO, on August the 8th, 2014, yet that index case had been in 2013. And interestingly, at the same time, as this epidemic going forward, we've had small outbreaks in Nigeria, Mali and Senegal that were contained by public health measures, and a totally independent one of a different strain in the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the same time. Why did this spread so much? It spread because, and I think we'll explore this more, the health and wider public health infrastructure of these countries was inherently weak. It spread because it got into urban areas, and this was the first time it had got there, and we played too slow a role as an international community as a whole, and were slow to respond. And the warning sounds were sounded, particularly by MSF, but they weren't initially acted on. I'm not going to go into it more, except to say that the UK government, once we got going, has responded amazingly. And I have to say I'm proud of what the UK government has done, but I know Chris will go into that and we'll discuss it more. So let me turn over first to Neil Ferguson. What I do want to highlight is all of us have been working through the scientific advisory system for emergencies, advising government. And that SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, is co-chaired for a health emergency by the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Mark Walpert, and myself as chief medical advisor. So we have all played different roles in this, and we were discussing that we're getting to the point where we will need to learn the lessons about how well we worked as a scientific community in the interests of the public's health. Neil, over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to slightly elaborate what Sally just said in terms of giving an overview, not so much of the modelling of the epidemic, but really of the epidemiology of this epidemic and how it's progressed. I should say at the start, the byline here, WHO Ebola Response Team Collaboration. I head a research centre funded by the Medical Research Council and the National Institute of Health Research at Imperial College, and we are a World Health Organizing collaborating centre, and so it was ourselves who were the first group outside the World Health Organization to receive the detailed data on what was happening on the ground in West Africa in August last year. And as Sally just mentioned, perhaps it's some indication of a delay in response, that it was only in August that WHO Geneva were starting to get very detailed data on what was happening, many months too late. So that's the context to which we've been working. A team of up to 20 of us at times have been working intensively for the last 7 months on this, sometimes with many sleepless nights, and I'm sure my colleagues sitting on the panel will share that experience. I don't need to cover this slide. Sally's always nicely introduced Ebola. It is a zoonotic pathogen. It has we think it's bats, we're not completely sure. One point I would just mention, it's an RNA virus. What does that mean? Well, it means it uses the other form of nucleic genetic code other than DNA. It also means that in its replication, it's very error-prone. So Ebola, like many other viruses, HIV, influenza, has a very high error rate. So just to put one myth to rest, all RNA viruses evolve in some sense, mutate very quickly, but we don't have any strong evidence that this virus is any different in this outbreak or has changed in how it's behaving compared with previous outbreaks. There's also no evidence of airborne transmission having evolved within this outbreak. As Sally said, it's really a virus transmitted via bodily fluids. So where are we in the epidemic? And I apologise, this slide is a couple of weeks out of date now. We've seen an epidemic of, just from reported cases alone, of over 20,000 cases, which makes it of the order of 50 times larger than the previous outbreak, the largest previous outbreak of Ebola ever seen. And it has, whilst it started in Guinea, and you'll see that from these epidemic curves on top, it started many months before the other countries, Liberia and Sierra Leone, which were badly affected. We saw a stuttering epidemic to start with, then an enormous takeoff in the late spring and summer of last year. As I'll talk about in a moment, the pattern of cases we necessarily see in these things should be taken sometimes with a pinch of salt. Case detection has not been perfect through this epidemic, and particularly in the more remote areas, and I'm sure Melissa will return to this. It is quite likely there have been twice, maybe even 3 times as many cases actually have occurred in country as have been reported. Control started to be achieved first in Liberia. You'll see that, and focus on the pale bars, which are the confirmed cases, and then the darker bars are the suspect cases, not always confirmed. We're now down at 0 cases in Liberia in the last couple of weeks. Very encouraging, the first country to achieve control. The situation's a little less encouraging in Sierra Leone. We've had a great deal of success in pushing down transmission in the last couple of months compared with its peak, but we're still getting consistent numbers of cases week on week, 56 confirmed cases last week, and we have a long way to go. Guinea is perhaps the most concerning in the sense that the downward trend is least convincing there, and we have most concerns about the extent to which we're detecting cases in rural areas. As Sally said, it's been a UK priority to help all the countries of the affected region. By a UK priority, I don't just mean a government priority, a priority of also the scientific and health communities based in both the NHS and in universities. But a particular focus has clearly been on Sierra Leone, and Chris will talk to that in his talk. I think it's useful to look at the spatial evolution of the epidemic through time, though. It started in yellow in Guecudo in the middle there. One of the interesting things, you see these things flashing up, and I'll go through it again, is how quickly it spread. And in particular within Guinea to start with, within a few days of cases, or a few weeks of the cases arising in Guecudo, it has spread all the way across the country to the west to Conakry. And it belies one of the myths about sub-Saharan Africa, which is no longer true, is that population mobility is limited. There's a major N1 motorway going from east to west of Guinea, recently paved, which allows you to travel from one side of the country to the other in 8 hours, about the time it takes us to travel this country, which is well used. And what we've seen in this outbreak is a very rapid spatial spread, which has posed challenges, not because we don't know how to control Ebola, but in terms of getting capacity in the right place at the right time. I've talked to the other bullet points on this slide. We're now seeing infection really concentrated much more. This is out of date, but really been eliminated from Liberia at the bottom, a bit more dispersed, but really still focused in a few focal areas in Sierra Leone in the middle, but much more, and that's another worrying sign about Guinea, much more geographically dispersed in Guinea. So how did this virus spread? And I mean, what were the risk factors from spreading from person to person? Well, we knew quite a lot about this in general terms before the outbreak started, but one of the things essential to controlling any outbreak of an emerging disease is to get detailed data, collect information from cases as you see them, their families, and find out who they came into contact with. And this contact tracing information is vital for following up on people who might have been exposed, but also for understanding how the virus is passing from person to person. You can visualize this data in many different ways. This partial graph represents even node as a case, and the links between cases represent transmission events which we've verified in the data. It's not all connected together because we have very partial data. The different colors represent cases who have died, cases who've survived, or cases where we don't know the outcome. But through the analysis of this sort of data, which is what we and others have been doing, you can get a lot of detailed information on what really are the risk factors for transmission. So what do we know? We know, first of all, that funerals, particularly funerals of prominent individuals, but really a lot of funerals have been key to transmission because of the funeral rites which are typically associated with these communities, touching the body and to pay respect in particular, and also the rites around preparation for funerals. Depending on the context and the district, about 1/5 to 1/3 of transmission we think has occurred at funerals. The rest has been occurring in the community, but when we say the community, it's actually a little more focused than that. Really about 50% of all infections, outside funeral infections, have been occurring between close family members in the household. Often a tragedy. I remember looking at the early data from the line lists and seeing first maybe the father die, then the mother, then the children 2 weeks later in the same household. And what we know now, very strong evidence, is patients are most infectious close to death or after death. What do we know about severity of illness? And here the case numbers and the numbers of deaths reported in the public media and by WHO don't paint the full picture, because not every case is followed up. So often, whilst we have cases reported, we don't know what happened to them. If you're careful in that analysis, then what you can determine is probably like 60 to 70% of cases have died overall, consistently through this epidemic. Getting prompt hospitalisation may reduce that by maybe 10%, but no more. We have limited options for treating cases of Ebola. We also know that infection risk and the rate of death has been lower in children, for instance, in young adults, than it has been in older individuals. But some myths have also arisen. There is no evidence, for instance, of any difference in risk of infection or risk of death by gender. So what do we need to do to control Ebola transmission? Well, we've known this. We knew this at the start of this epidemic, and as I said, this virus is no different. The challenge is getting the resources into play for every case which are needed to implement these sort of measures. We need to identify cases promptly, isolate them as promptly as possible with good infection control, and of course give palliative care to those people who are affected. We need to then trace, when we've detected a case, who they've been in contact with and follow them up, monitor them for signs and symptoms. If we have the resources, maybe even proactively isolate those people. And we need to limit transmission at funerals. That has been incredibly challenging during this outbreak. We haven't had the capacity to diagnose new cases. Lab capacity has been limited, also teams to follow up. Contact tracing is immensely resource intensive in terms of person time. It can take, just to trace, follow up 10 contacts of one individual, and often individuals who might report 20 contacts are still a full-time person to chase them every day, particularly given the fact that often you have to visit them. A huge challenge, and I'll come on to that in the next slide, has been the number of hospital beds. But even when we've had hospital beds in place for putting cases into hospital and isolating contacts, infection control in those hospitals, limiting transmission to healthcare workers and to other patients, has not always been perfect. I've mentioned the challenge of implementing safe and dignified burials. That layers on top of a whole problem which has perhaps been at the root of the early spread of this outbreak and its difficulty to control, which is getting population buy-in for the health measures being put in place. And I'm sure Melissa will talk to that. Laid on top of the poor healthcare infrastructure, and that all fed into the inadequate initial international response. Just to take one example, and ourselves, colleagues at the London School and others, did a lot of modelling back in October and November looking at this problem for DFID and for the UK government. This is from a discussion piece I co-authored with Chris Whitty and many others, and Jeremy, looking at what makes a challenging control situation. And the problem with getting capacity in place is the epidemic is growing exponentially ahead of you. So if you can't get interventions in place sufficiently promptly to turn over the epidemic curve, to reduce transmission so it's declining, your goal moves exponentially further away, and you need exponentially more beds or exponentially more teams of people on the ground to get on top of it. So every short delay in getting on top of an epidemic like this leads to a catastrophically worse outcome. As I said at the start, things are moving in the right direction now, but really there is no room for complacency. WHO have coined the term the road to zero. I have to say I copied this from Sony, who've used it for their environmental sustainability goal for their corporation, but it's a nice picture. The case numbers are now declining, but only because of enormous effort on the ground from the countries concerned and the international support for that effort, which has been put in place. We can't, if we release that effort, we're complacent at all, or let go, or fail to put in support, case numbers will just rebound again. And just because epidemics are highly non-linear, stochastic, random processes, the road down to zero is going to be bumpy. We will have resurgence. We can't afford to release the capacity we've put in place. It'll be a particular challenge to get on top of transmission in the most rural, remote areas of Guinea, which are the most resistant, I should say, to people coming in and telling them what to do. And finally, I mean, as Sally was said, the UK needs to remain engaged, but I'm confident it will remain engaged.
Thank you very much, Neil. I hand over to Melissa. Thank you.
Okay, so if I could have my slides. What I'd like to talk about is how it is that what's been described as a zoonotic spillover event, that initial transmission to patient zero, to Emile Wamuno in the Kissi region of Guinea, became, in a kind of spiral, the crisis and drama that we've seen over the last year. And to suggest that actually the reasons are fundamentally social and cultural, but also political and economic. And that implicated are factors that both hastened the spread of Ebola, but also led it to become an epidemic of fear in which populations were resisting early outbreak responses and compromising them. And I want to suggest that we need to recognize a set of institutions, a context that I'm going to call, for want of a better term, structural violence, which helps to underline that. And which means that there are some really quite significant lessons for the longer term rebuilding beyond the end of the epidemic, or beyond the zero that we hope will happen in the coming months, towards building more resilient futures in this region and elsewhere. So a starting point is to recognize that Ebola is a disease deeply linked to social life, and that in a funny way almost targets the socially and morally good in local society. If we look at the transmission routes that Neil talked about, it's actually the most sociable people. It's those who care properly for their loved ones. It's those who bury the dead properly and look after the dying. And it's, of course, healers and doctors, because a lot of transmission has been within healthcare settings, who are amongst the most respected people in these societies. And in that context, perhaps it's initially not surprising that some of the public health recommendations have seemed quite antisocial. Don't touch people. Don't bury, or at least bury as soon as possible, or cremate, as has been the policy in Liberia. Or indeed to send sick family members to what can seem like quite alien, foreign-managed treatment units. I'm going to return to some of this in a minute. But just to look a bit closer at these transmission routes. The main routes of transmission in this region have been, okay, first of all, caring for the sick. This transmission to family members has come about because people have looked after each other as they've been ill, as they've been dying. There are many commonalities of social practice and of people's presumptions about care that run across the different ethnic groups in this region who've been affected by Ebola, the Kissi across the border region, the Mende in Sierra Leone, the Toma and Loma, and many others. Caring properly for the sick is an absolutely fundamental part of people's lives. People would assume to do home care. Those roles do tend to fall primarily to women, although men will also take on caring roles. And care is also very personal, which underlies some of the fears about sending people to be, quotes, cared for in treatment units, where people are not necessarily confident that they will get the kind of care that they need. Care also extends to the dying and the dead. And funeral practices have indeed been a major source of transmission, but we have to see those as related to social and cultural protocols around death, which are pretty vital in this region, partly for material reasons. If one doesn't do the right thing with somebody who is dying, respect last wishes, sort out inheritance issues, have the right people, the in-laws, the relations visit, there can be all sorts of repercussions for the living in terms of disputes over land, disputes over property, fallings out across extended families. Equally, certain burial rites are to do with identifying the cause of death and making sure that a person becomes a proper ancestor and that their spirit doesn't continue to wander the world. And this is why there are a number of rites involved around death, which involve the washing of corpses, but almost a little bit more like an undertaker role, as we'd see in this country. Inquiries with people don't suggest that there's something mystical or deeply traditional about washing. It's almost a kind of body preparation task. But there are sacrifices that are done, and there are obligations for people to come and visit and be there, and sometimes they do touch bodies. And that's why, particularly, we've seen not just transmission through everyday burials, but particularly the capacity of funerals of some really key members of society, particularly people like traditional healers and the elders and officials of the men's and women's initiation societies that in different variants are common across this region, become what in epidemiological terms would be called super spreader events, events where one contact actually spreads to lots of people. As far as we know, this is less about the nature of the rites that happen and more about the fact that lots of people come. But it's also the case that for the Initiation Society officials, there are some secret rituals associated with dealing with their bodies. And probing these is quite counterproductive. They are genuinely secret for cultural reasons. And probing them as if there was some way that we could find out the clue of what really happens and how Ebola transmission really happens tends rather to convey to society members that their values are under attack, and that has tended to result in resistance and hiding of cases. So respect for social and cultural practices has been very important, but it's also become clear that with time, given the proper information, communities have adapted their practices through things like adapting rituals to minimize touching or to delay some of these big social gatherings, learning in a way how to balance the social protocols with those required around infection. Ebola's been transmitting along social networks linked to the ways people move in a highly mobile region, for marriage and visits to kin, for festivals, for trade, for migration between rural and urban areas. One of the things we've seen in rural areas is a pattern by which often an outbreak in an isolated rural village has then spread to a market town and along a trade route and has multiplied. And then sometimes as somebody's travelled back to a village, it's gone rural again. And so we've seen this kind of pendulum swing between trade routes and isolated rural villages. We also saw from the very beginning some communities who protected themselves successfully from Ebola, drawing on chieftaincy and respected local institutions to enact bylaws to prevent kin from infected areas from entering communities. This is actually the village where I lived in the late 1980s, which by all reports survived Ebola in the way that it survived the recent civil war and very likely the smallpox epidemics of the 1970s by locally imposed quarantines. And in the latter stages of the response, doing this in Sierra Leone has actually become a chieftain-wide act, and chieftains have been encouraged to impose these bylaws. It's questionable whether imposed top-down they work as well as the ones that came from communities' own reactions, but nevertheless in some areas they've been effective. But crucially, this epidemic went urban, and it went urban early. It powered through growing and crowded urban centres and peri-urban areas, which are themselves a legacy of neglected rural development, rural education and employment, and of the civil wars here. So that these were rapidly growing slum areas, peri-urban places with very poor services and a lot of overcrowding. And those were conditions in which it was very easy for Ebola to spread and very difficult for people to protect themselves from it. We've also seen Ebola spreading through very resource-poor, under-invested in health systems. It's poor facilities and poor infection control abilities that meant that more than 10% of the deaths have been of healthcare workers that these countries could ill afford to lose. And the healthcare systems, it's important to note in these countries, even before the Ebola outbreak, desperately lacked resources, stuff and staff. And were for that reason often quite neglected by local populations. People wouldn't bother to go to a formal health centre because they'd often get there and find that there were no drugs, no nurses. The assumption was often home care and the use of traditional healers. And that's partly why people have been quite slow to come forward to formal health facilities in the context of the Ebola response, and it's taken a while to build people's confidence in health facilities. But more deeply, the spread of Ebola does also, I think, reflect the fact that this epidemic of a virus became quite early on an epidemic of fear. and one that intensified through September and October as the international response set in. So this picture is the storming of a clinic in West Point in Monrovia as people objected to what they saw as dangerous incarceration of relatives in a treatment unit there. It's just one among many incidents where fear and distrust, the idea that the spread of the virus, but also what outbreak control teams were doing, was part of a plot to depopulate people or to steal their body parts or to do harm, really compromised the response and contributed to the magnification of the crisis. These are just some of the other incidents. They started from the very beginning. So from the start when MSF began to visit villages in Guinea, in the Kissi region, in the early summer, they often found their vehicles being stoned, and there were 20 villages in Guinea that cut themselves off early on and didn't open up their borders, as it were, till very, very late. The most dramatic event, of course, was in the village of Womi, where on September the 16th, 8 members of an Ebola sensitization team were killed, not by the Ebola virus. These deaths were actually due to the machetes of villagers in an organized form of violence that absolutely cannot be exonerated, but I think requires some understanding that doesn't just attribute this somehow to superstition and barbarism. So this, to go back to the village Meliandu in the Kissi country, which is ground zero, where patient zero, where Emil Wamuno and his family lived and then died. These are some of the ideas that have circulated about Ebola as people came to terms with it, locating it as a conspiracy whether by foreigners against Africans, by oppositional politicians against the quite marginalised Kissi people of the forest region, or by miners seeking to depopulate the area and get hold of their land. These reflect, I think, real fears of a distant state which seeks often to profit from people, of elites who've gained power often at the expense of local livelihoods, and extractive foreigners. Interestingly, that village of Meliandu is only about 10 kilometres from the mountain of iron ore that's referred to in that quote, Simandu, here, where a group of multinational companies are prospecting for iron ore that is seen to be both the saviour of the world iron ore economy and important for Africa. It's just one example here of recent decades of development in this region, supported by international agencies, the World Bank and the IMF, which have been focused heavily on foreign direct investment, which has produced extraordinarily high growth rates. Sierra Leone grew at 21% in 2013, yet has often dispossessed local communities, has often been mired in governance and corruption scandals. And certainly this has not been investment and growth that's translated into the building of basic state services and trusted institutions that would have been important to responding to Ebola.
Melissa, can you speed up a bit?
Yeah, I'm speeding up.
Over time. Thanks.
Latest instances in the history of an unequal political economy. Added to which, we have to appreciate the legacies of conflict in the region, 2 decades of civil war in both Liberia and Sierra Leone, which spilt over into Guinea, limited post-conflict recovery and a situation of uncertainty and again a distant state in these areas. So in sum, I think these contextual causes beyond the immediate transmission dynamics in health system failures, in a political economy of extractive kinds of development, and in a very distant state, can be seen as dimensions of structural violence, a combination of institutions which have prevented people from meeting their basic health needs and building resilience to responses. And I think we need to understand those things if we're to see why this became the crisis that it did. It underlines too why local institutions have been, and learning have been so important to turning the epidemic around. We don't yet know what has helped to bend the curve in these countries, but I think as the analysis begins to be done, we'll see that it was perhaps a combination of what foreign governments did, but also the ways they were able to engage with communities and the ways those communities themselves learnt about Ebola and learnt to respond to it and minimize infection damage themselves. So finally, I think there are implications for the future, which suggests that we need to be cleverer about understanding and appreciating these political contexts and attuning responses to deal with them, not just to attribute spread to culture or ignorance. And I think we need to think now, as hopefully we see the end of this epidemic and begin to think about rebuilding, that it's not just rebuilding, but it's maybe rebuilding a bit differently in terms of basic health capacities and trusted institutions, in which local knowledge and institutions and community engagement are absolutely at the heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. We hand over to Chris Whitty.
I'm glad to say that the previous two speakers have said most of the things I was intending to say. So for Sally's benefit, I'm going to keep this pretty short. But I just wanted to take us back a bit. A lot of what Neil said at the beginning was not known at the point when we were trying to plan this response in August. And I think one of the things, not in anyone in this panel's case, but that's happened globally, is lots of people have been wise after the event who were distinctly not wise at the time when we were actually trying to plan things in August. So once the WHO had announced that this was an international emergency, and that had been accepted by the countries, the UK agreed to take on the lead responsibility as a bilateral for supporting Sierra Leone. America did the same, the US did the same in Liberia, and France and Guinea. So I'm going to talk primarily about Sierra Leone, but most of the things I'm going to say would have applied to any of those. And at that point, what we faced was a situation where the doubling time for the epidemic appeared to be around 30 days. That's to say, every 30 days, the number of cases was going to double. And it was just going to carry on doubling, so you went up from 200 to 400 to 800, and so on, roughly every month. The R0, the R, for those who are epidemiologists, was probably somewhere between 1.5 and 2. Now, R is where 1 is where a disease is stable in a population. 1 case leads to 1 case. If it's half, it's dying out. But if it's 2, it's doubling every time. So it was significantly above 1. And what this told us was that this epidemic was going to carry on going up exponentially. And not only did we think that the numbers of cases were likely to go up, but that almost certainly it would then start to roll out across the rest of West Africa from the central 3 countries that are involved. So we were facing a really substantial crisis. And very large numbers of the things that we needed to know, we did not know. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on these next 5 or 6 minutes, because I think some of the other points have been made. The UK decided, in support of the government of Sierra Leone, to concentrate on 4 things, because we had one strategic goal and one strategic goal only at this point in the epidemic, and that was to get the R0 below 1. Whilst it was above 1, it was going to carry on increasing, and the probability is it would overwhelm our capacity to respond. So we had to get it to below 1. And all other aims had to be subsidiary to that one. So anything that stood in the way of that, even if it was desirable in other ways, like managing malaria and other febrile illnesses in the country better, had to be put as a secondary concern. And the 4 things we did was, first of all, there are 2 methods by which previous epidemics we knew there was substantial transmission. The first was in hospital. Now, the easy thing here is we knew what to do scientifically, in the sense of actually how to prevent transmission in hospitals. The difficult thing was we did not have the staff, we did not have the kit, and in fact we did not have the hospital beds at the point of this. So there was a very large period of building up the hospital capacity. The Royal Engineers and many other parts of the UK government played a major role in doing this. Now, the scientific challenges for this were still non-trivial. Just to take a very small example, we did not actually know how long Ebola remained in sewage. We did not know what the geology of the places we were building was. This was the rainy season. We thought there was a real risk that Ebola could actually seep from hospitals where things were being built into watercourses which people were drinking from. We didn't know whether that was dangerous. So these kinds of bits of science, there were multiple bits of this, were essential even for building our hospitals. We also knew it would take us at least 6 weeks to 3 months to build them, and yet the epidemic was moving very fast. So the second bit of science we needed was to project, with a combination of mathematical modelling and common sense, where would the epidemic go next? Because there's no point building a hospital in the place where the epidemic was 6 weeks ago. So we had to combine geological and mathematical and biological sciences, with quite a lot of politics, because people aren't necessarily going to have a hospital for treating Ebola built on their doorstep, and quite a lot had to be done to encourage local populations and the government. Moving on to burials. Burials is the second thing which is well known from other outbreaks, particularly in DRC and Uganda. We know that they're a major component. And here, the big challenge was not burying people safely biologically. We know how to do that. There's a well-established method for doing it. The difficulty, as Melissa has said, was social. We knew generically it is absolutely essential to get people to buy into the fact you're going to bury people safely. But the problem is that most people do not want to bury someone safely if that means stopping all the rituals which depend on them linking themselves to their loved ones, the senior people in their community. And the more senior someone is, as Melissa said, both the more resistant people were, but the more likely people were to actually be infected. Some of the big burials led to 40, 50, 60 cases from one person being buried. So we had to get on top of that, and that depended on very strong support from our colleagues from social sciences, in which Melissa and others took part. Linked to that, there had, of course, to be a major issue around diagnostics and a major issue around command and control. Diagnostics, because we didn't want to have to bury all the people who did not have Ebola as if they had Ebola, both because everyone would refuse, and secondly, we didn't have the logistical ability. And yet we didn't have diagnostic capacity at this point. So there was a lot of work going in to try to how to speed up diagnosis, whether we could use things like mouth swabs to try and do this. So there were some technical issues, but there were also issues about how we site the various labs to make it the shortest time period between actually getting a burial time and getting a result, speeding up the flow of information in both directions. All of these required research or proper data to make the decisions. The third area, though, was our biggest challenge. The massive amount of transmission in the community, which Neil mentioned in his talk. Because this had not occurred in previous epidemics. And moreover, we'd never had epidemics previously in urban and peri-urban areas in a substantial way. So we then decided we had to devise a new methodology, because the old way of doing this, the standard way of doing this, was to find all the contacts and to isolate them all. But at a point where we could easily see we were going to have 500 or 600 cases a week, which we did, the possibility of isolating all the possible suspect cases was simply logistically impossible. So we had to move to a system where we would get people to self-isolate, and that meant experimenting with community centres where people could go in, could be with a fever, and then they would be kept isolated from one another and from the community, treated for what they might have, and then if they had Ebola, moved swiftly to an Ebola centre. Easy to say that, really difficult to do. You need to build them in the right places, you need to train people, you need actually to get the diagnostic flow properly to work, and you have to have treatment beds for them to go to. And above all, you have to protect staff. And this is where we ran into the biggest clash of two major priorities. At the point we were planning our interventions, our calculation and CDC's calculation were both that the average healthcare worker in Sierra Leone had an infection rate of about 10% per person year. And over 70% of those were going to die. So it was absolutely essential to train these people and equip them properly, completely unethical not to, and yet every month, every week we lost, we were losing ground and had the risk of being overwhelmed. So we basically were in a hurry because of the need of the epidemic, and yet had to go slowly enough we could protect the healthcare workers. And getting this balance right, both in terms of modelling it out and also the practicalities, were very substantial. And finally, there were issues around communication, and this is the area where we really do not know which of our interventions have had any kind of effect at all. We have thrown communications at all three countries in Africa, which were highly affected. Radio, press, interviews, whatever you want, communications have happened, yet we do not know which of those had an effect, and we don't actually know which of those had any impact on changing the epidemic. Was it useful to close down the roads? We don't know. Was it useful to close down the schools? We don't know that either. Probably all of these had a small attributable fraction, but were they a big enough fraction to justify the enormous hit to the economy and to development that things like closing off schooling and transport are involved in? So I think that we have learnt a lot as we've gone along, and Jeremy, I think, is going to talk about the treatment side, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. We've learnt a lot in that area as well. But there are still many things many things we know now which we did not know at the beginning of this epidemic. And we, fortunately, we did design an epidemic response which involved isolation in multiple different ways, really stepping up by Public Health England, the Army, DFID, the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office, working together very closely with the Department of Health here. We did manage to do a response which did manage to get on top of it, but that was not a given. And in August, it was a very, very close run thing. I think my own view is 1 more month, certainly 2 more months, and we would have been overwhelmed. And that would have been a really serious disaster for that part of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So now, Jeremy will talk about new treatments and vaccines, please.
Thanks very much. I've got no slides, but that doesn't mean to say I'm not well prepared, of course. I'm going to talk a little bit to bring people up to date with where I think we are with treatments and vaccines, and then perhaps broaden the discussion out to open it up for the discussion about where I think we might need to go for the future. And so a lot of those comments will build on a personal experience which goes back very much to the days of SARS. And although I think we've learnt, as we've just heard from the previous 3 speakers, an awful lot about epidemics and how to respond, I think there is one huge gap in that, and that's the community that until recently I was part of, and that's the clinical research community, who I don't think have moved anywhere near as fast as others have done on the platform. So very, very briefly, to bring up to date with where we are, I think, on treatment and vaccines in a sort of list-like form, the critical thing to remember here is these patients are unbelievably sick. 60 or 70% of people with Ebola in the context of the current epidemic will die. And the truth is, many of those would die in any context anywhere in the world. And if you've watched, as I'm sure everyone has done, how patients have been treated in the US, in Europe, the resources that need to go into looking after these patients is huge. And the fear for the individuals, the nurses, the healthcare workers, the doctors who are looking after these patients is really significant. These patients have very severe diarrhea, they have very severe vomiting. Taking blood or putting any lines into anybody's veins or anything is a risk that you're putting yourself at as an individual nurse or doctor. And that means that what you do is limited. And in the context of West Africa at the moment, all of the resources that have been available in the Western countries where patients have been treated are just not available. So your room for error is much smaller. Treating a patient with large amounts of intravenous fluids is a relatively trivial thing to do in a Western hospital. It's extraordinarily difficult to do in a context of West Africa or Southeast Asia, and particularly where you can't provide the sort of levels of care. So basic clinical management is extraordinarily difficult. The second thing, coming on to now specific treatment, and it's true for both treatment and vaccines, the only context in which one can learn how to move treatment and vaccines forward is during an Ebola epidemic. There are no Ebola cases outside an epidemic, so you can't learn lessons in the inter-epidemic period. And the only opportunity to learn those lessons is during the epidemic. The drugs that we have available, the WHO actually in August started to think about what treatments should be trialled and created a priority list with a lot of background thought, and in fact I think still that priority list remains reasonably sensible. There are antiviral drugs specifically which target in some way, shape or form the virus. I think those are potentially very, very important for 2 reasons. One is, on the whole, in infectious diseases, if you reduce the amount of pathogen in the body, on the whole, that's a good thing. If you reduce the amount of malaria parasites in the body with a treatment, most patients will do better. If you reduce the amount of HIV in the body of somebody with HIV, on the whole, patients will do better. And it is probably true, but I don't have the evidence to support it, that if you do that in Ebola, it's probably going to be good for you. The second thing, of course, it does, is as you reduce the pathogen burden within a body, you reduce the potential for transmission within the healthcare setting. So the treatment itself can be both treating the individual and treating the community they're in, certainly in the healthcare sector. So there are antiviral drugs. Back in 1976, blood was tried. and a limited number of patients were treated with the blood of survivors from Ebola, and that has been tried again in this context. And as you'll probably have heard, there has been a black market in selling blood from survivors across West Africa, and gradually people are now moving into assessments of both plasma and whole blood therapy and monoclonal antibodies, and everybody's heard of ZMapp, which is a cocktail of 3 antibodies produced in tobacco plants and given to people exclusively, with 1 or 2 exceptions, people who have landed in the United States and in Europe. Those drugs, that ZMapp, is not been available in West Africa, and the production pipeline makes it very difficult to make it available. Moving on to vaccines, there are essentially 3 vaccines in later stage development. One produced by the Canadian Public Health Authority, taken forward by a very small company called Newlink, now being taken over by Merck. VSV vaccine, that is a vaccine which a virus which replicates to a limited degree in individuals and which expresses the glycoprotein of Ebola and produces both an immune response and, we hope, a protective response. It was actually originally developed as both a prophylactic vaccine and a post-exposure vaccine. And many years ago, in a lab accident in Germany, a supply of this vaccine was made available to a lab technician who had a needle stick injury. The individual survived, and there's no information to know whether she was actually ever infected. But it was developed both as a post-exposure and a pre-exposure vaccine. There are 2 other vaccine developments. One is being developed by GSK and one by Johnson & Johnson. They both use similar technology based on an adeno vector and is a prime boost strategy. You give 1 vaccine followed some weeks later by a second vaccine in the hope of producing longer lasting immunity. Those are where we are. The NIH is moving forward with a VSV versus adeno versus placebo trial in Liberia. The WHO is moving with London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine with a VSV vaccine in Guinea, and CDC is going ahead with a VSV vaccine trial in Sierra Leone. The Liberia one has started, but of course, as we've heard, there's been no cases in Liberia in the last 2 weeks, and so it's highly likely that in order to prove vaccine efficacy, it's likely to be the ones led from Sierra Leone or Guinea, which will provide an idea of vaccine efficacy. And I'll come back to that because I think it's a major issue in going forward. So that's where we are with vaccines and treatment. I think there's some other critical things to mention, some of which have been mentioned. Ebola has been absolutely dreadful for West Africa, but we have to put it in the context of what else is happening. There's been essentially no maternity care in West Africa over many. It's been very difficult to have safe childbirth. We can, I think, already predict a potential measles outbreak in the coming years because measles vaccination rates have dropped well below what is protective for a community. And malaria treatment, TB treatment, HIV treatment, diabetes control, and the rest of the healthcare sector has really suffered as a result of the epidemic for Ebola. There's one point I'd like to make which is beyond medicine, and that is the sense that Melissa talked about communication and society and the trust that goes with it. And one of the issues in Ebola that certainly marked the initial communication strategies around Ebola was the fear factor that this was a death sentence and was untreatable. And many of us in this room went through a previous episode where we had an infectious disease which was untreatable and for which we had no vaccine. In the 1980s, that was HIV. And the dynamic of the epidemic, when we started to say that you could treat this infection, changed the nature of the epidemic. And I think we've underestimated the importance of both communication, but also the importance of developing treatments and vaccines for these emerging infections, because they do, or they potentially can do, change the nature of the epidemic. For all of the drugs and all of the vaccines I've mentioned, there was development mostly through government funding, and NIH deserves great credit for the development of some of those vaccines. None of them were taken forward to the critical stage, which is to demonstrate safety. And so we were left in July and August until just a few days ago, catching up in that 6-month period to ensure that these vaccines and treatments were safe in healthy individuals, because without that information, you cannot go through to using them in communities. And one of the lessons to be learned has, for the limited number of infections which we believe could cause regional or global problems, we have to take the putative vaccines and treatments at least to the stage of phase 1 testing, so that when an epidemic occurs, one can move much faster than we have done. And that has been true of every epidemic since 2004 and SARS. If you ask yourself the question, SARS, even I might say flu, but there may be others that disagree with that, Enterovirus 71, a major epidemic in Southeast Asia at the moment, MERS-CoV in the Middle East, a coronavirus which continues to circulate, and you ask yourself the question, do you know who to treat, with which drug, at which dose, for how long? We don't know, I believe, the answer to any of those epidemics of the last decade. And one of the problems is that although Neil's community of modelers, the epidemiological community, the virology community, and actually the social science community have, I think, over the last decade stepped up to the mark, the clinical research community has not. And as a result of that, we have not been able to take forward treatments and vaccines into testing as quickly as we have needed to. There's a figure that is old now, and Sally hates me repeating this, but the average time from idea to first patient recruited a few years ago in North America and Europe was 608 days. With your average epidemic, actually, you'd have 14 epidemics by the time you got through to treatment. We're now, I think, at 425 days since the start of the Ebola outbreak before the first individual received a vaccine or a treatment with part of data collection that went along with it. And with the epidemic that we're likely to face in the 21st century and the movement of people and the speed of that movement, we can't accept 425 days. I don't believe we can accept 42 days. I think if you're really ambitious, you're going to have to be able to say we could do that within a limited number of days, single figures. And I'd like to get to 4 days that one would be able to do that. And there are all sorts of problems and difficulties of why we can't do that. There's regulatory environments, there's ethics, there's the design of the protocol. There's arguments going on today about whether treatments in the context of Ebola should be placebo-controlled or not. And we might come back to a discussion about whether we think that's justified. There are arguments about the designs of trials today in the context of this epidemic. And that seems unacceptable to me. There are very different perspectives from patients, from families, from society, from commercial sector, from governments, from clinicians. There's a very different perspective on research from the MSF community than there is from the research community. And there is, again, from the regulators. So unless we bring these all together and actually appreciate what it takes to move drugs, diagnostics and vaccines and some of the other research questions that we inevitably will face in epidemics of the 21st century, we will move no quicker than we moved in the 5 epidemics that I've mentioned since 2004. I'm going to just finish off 1 second. We live in the 21st century. And if you ask yourself, we've brought this epidemic under control, potentially, or we think we've contributed to bring it under control, what have we done in this epidemic that we wouldn't have done at the time of Jon Snow? We've isolated people, we've washed hands, we've worn masks, we've put people in isolation, we've separated them from their loved ones. What else have we truly done that Jon Snow wouldn't have done in this city in the year he did it, which I've forgotten? And I'll finish there.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask each panel member a question and ask them to answer quickly while you all assemble your questions. So I'm going to start with Chris. And the question I've got for you, and it needs to be quite short, and you wanted to add something on, very short, was the UK population ever at risk? Because no one's addressed that.
No.
Good. Right. What did you want to add?
The one thing I wanted to add was just to Jeremy's points, which is that I think we shouldn't think that just because clinical trials weren't done, there wasn't an improvement in treatment. The mortality in the good hospitals has gone down remarkably, and I'd like to pay tribute enormously to clinicians, both for their courage, because it took real courage to take this on, but also for the fact they have improved treatment substantially. I think the sad thing is we haven't captured that formally, but there's no doubt that mortality is way down now for people in proper treatment centres compared to where it was at the beginning of the epidemic, and that's just basic fluids and antibiotics and good clinical care.
Thank you. So I was going to ask you, Neil, the issue came up actually with Melissa, but as you do the epidemiology and the modelling, would you interrupt schools and transport again if we were in this position again? This is partly naughty because when we get flu, he says, we'd better close the schools. So I want to know where he's coming from.
I think Sally's referring to a Whitehall exercise in which we were hypothesising there would be a very lethal flu pandemic, and in which case closing schools can be a rational thing. I think for Ebola, it is less clear-cut whether closing schools really brought anything, and it clearly is very disruptive of society, and indeed the fact that it increased exposure of children in the household setting, arguably, because they were at home or going around the community, may have actually contributed to things. Fortunately, however, children actually have been less affected than adults. Travel restrictions are always controversial and actually quite difficult to evaluate. The first thing I'd probably say, and Sally won't know me saying this, is that imposing screening at UK borders probably brought us very little at all. Messaging travellers who come to this country from regions with outbreaks is a very different thing, and good communication, them knowing who to call if they're ill, is very different. Actually, screening is not so effective. Within the country, though, it depends on what stage you're at. I think if you're very early on and you want to limit spread, and Melissa made reference to this in terms of isolation, when numbers are small, restricting movement, particularly if it's imposed by the communities themselves, can have some benefit. When case numbers are large, given how mobile societies are nowadays and communities are, it only takes one person to move the infection for your controls, which are always economically disruptive, to fail. And so relying on movement restrictions is probably dangerous. And it can buy you a little bit of time to build up capacity in other areas and mobile capacity, but it shouldn't be relied on.
Thank you. So I'll take Chairman's prerogative and just mention our screening for people coming in from West Africa. We always said we were not going to pick many, if any, up who were infected at the time, but it was a very it should be a very effective way of informing people coming in so that they knew A, what the symptoms were, B, that they could get treatment immediately as it's a public health issue, and C, what the phone number to ring if they got any of the symptoms was. So the main purpose of that screening was actually exactly what Neil said we probably needed, which was really good messaging. So let me now ask Melissa, rebuilding. What's your priority in rebuilding? Not that we've got rid of the epidemic yet, but...
fundamental basic health services in a system that is a public system, and there we're talking about actually funding and investment. There's messages here for the aid system that is talking about accessible basic maternal, child health, but also basic ailment services, which is not divided into, I think what we've seen over the last few decades is a tendency to divide health provision into different NGOs, different private providers, even different bilateral donors taking their pet disease, we'll focus on HIV, or taking their pet area, we'll do the Northeast, we'll do this. What's been lost in that process is the basic training of healthcare staff, the governance systems which enable staff to be paid, the fundamental state capacity. And I think there are also huge opportunities now to enroll some of the many private providers in a slightly more regulated way into this system. Most Sierra Leonean villages and Guinea and Liberia too, when they can't get to a health centre, would get their drugs from a table seller, an itinerant seller. I think there's a lot one can do to begin to regulate, to draw those providers into the system. And I think we also have the ability to draw in some surveillance for future epidemics, and surveillance and ability to be prepared into the way that health workers are trained and that systems operate.
Thank you. And then I'd like to start to see some hands so we can going up. So there's one here and one there for the first two, and then we'll come over there. Let me ask you, Jeremy, one question. So we've got 3 trials going on vaccines, and they're all the same vaccine. Is that the right position for the world to be in?
It's an unfortunate position for the world to be in. We don't have 3 vaccines today, I should say. We have 2 vaccines today. We have the adeno GSK, and we have the Merck VSV. The Johnson & Johnson one is not yet ready to move to West Africa. So as of today, we actually only have 2, to be honest, produced in sufficient numbers to go to studies. What I think is a shame is that the adeno one, to get into some detail, the prime boost strategy is not being utilised, and it's a prime only. And I'd be very surprised if that worked.
Thank you. So we've got a question over here. Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Jeffrey Hillard, just an interested individual. Could somebody speak about the role and the mechanisms of the WHO? Why was the waiting for the August announcement so pivotal? And if, as I assume, it was pivotal, is the WHO adequately resourced to respond again?
I think that falls to me, as I'm on the WHO's executive board representing all of us.
Well, therefore not.
Yeah. Oh, good. Do you want to do it?
You do.
Please. Please.
No, you start.
Under international health regulations, which were negotiated post-SARS, it was agreed that the world would pile in when the WHO announced a public health emergency of international concern. So the question's in 2 parts, really. Why were they delayed in calling that when MSF through the late spring, early summer were saying, hang on a minute, this is dreadful, people are dying in droves? And then did we do all right after that? And it was delayed. And I think I have said publicly on all our behalf at the WHO, it was, we are all shamed by this. My reading of it is that it was delayed because the countries, and I think it gets you into the social science, did not want to accept what was going on, did not actually have the capacity to capture the data as well, and didn't want to publicise it. The African Regional Office, who should have gone in and sorted it out, still think they did fine standing on the sidelines all the way through, not just before August the 8th, but after. And then there was, I think, a lack of coordination and direction from Geneva when they did come in. So there are a number of reviews ongoing. Do you want to add to that, Jeremy?
No, except to say, whilst I'm very critical of the WHO, ultimately the world needs a global body dedicated to public health. And if we do need that, and I strongly believe we do, then we have to support it and we have to fund it.
Thank you. I'm glad I didn't have to say that. Who's got the microphone? The other microphone? You? Yes? Right. Good.
Do you want me to introduce
Yes.
myself? My name's Elaine Hunter. I'm a clinical psychologist. I wanted to ask the panel, especially Melissa, given the physical needs in the country are hopefully reducing, what do you think are the mental health needs now in Sierra Leone specifically? And what and how could those needs be met?
Thank you.
Okay. I'm not a mental health expert, but in any sense. But what I would say is I think there's going to need to be some trauma counselling for people who have gone through real horrors and have lost family members and have really seen this crisis unfold on their doorstep. I think there's going to need to be support for the reintegration of Ebola survivors into their communities, which has not been easy. There's been stigma and fear associated with those who survived, linked to these beliefs that somehow Ebola had connections with violence, with the supernatural. Perhaps those who survived had connections with the sorcerers who were believed to be spreading the virus. So that's going to need to be handled carefully. But I think more broadly, there's a need to, as it were, rebuild community and national confidence. And to me, this goes along with, as it were, the rebuilding of trust through systems that are creating better links between communities and local institutions and government, so that this doesn't happen again. This was a crisis of trust, and it's an opportunity for some rethinking of how you rebuild trust and communication across different levels.
Thank you. One there. Young man further forwards then. Yep, there. And then one over there. Yep, young man.
Ian Thornton, UK CDS. Mainly for Chris. How do we keep this as a political priority with an election coming up, with a new minister that might want to focus on something new, and the changing media interest?
I don't think that the difficulty is going to be to keep this as a political priority in the next few months. I think the difficulty has always been that people always say after a big epidemic, never again, and then they do some things, and then about 4 or 5 years later, they actually lose interest because there hasn't been another epidemic, and then all the things they did are put away, and then the next epidemic comes along. Sally's nodding, so I'm in the right place here. But I don't think it's likely that any government is going to take this as a trivial issue. And this epidemic, to be clear, has not gone away yet, and it is, in my judgment, will not have gone away the other side of the election. So this is heading in the right direction, but there's a long way to go. And I'm very confident that the British government will stay with this.
Yes, of whichever parties.
Yeah.
Yes.
David Spratt, biomedical scientist. From watching the emergence of Ebola over the several years, there were sporadic cases cropping up all the time, and nothing very much happened because it was in Africa. Jeremy mentioned MERS-CoV virus, which seems to be following a similar pattern. Is there any difference in preparedness for that because it's in a developed country?
Neil.
So I work on both, and we work with the Saudi Arabian government on MERS coronavirus. There are some parallels. I mean, Saudi Arabia is an interesting context. It is not a developed country in the UK sense. I mean, they have a lot of money and they buy in capacity. What they're lacking is, in some sense, often homegrown capacity. And they also have problems in terms of the way governance, I should be careful what I say here, the way governance works, and often the consequence of admitting there's a problem is you lose your job within the health ministry and somebody replaces you, and that doesn't lead to the sort of openness which is always is helpful. So for both the early Ebola epidemic and the MERS epidemic, there was a huge problem in the countries letting data out, giving information to the outside world on what was saying, even sharing information internally to their own experts, which were present in Saudi Arabia and the region about what was going on. There still is a problem now in terms of, Jeremy highlighted the problem with clinical research. There's a problem with clinical research going on in the countries in terms of treatment with hospital infection control. Things are slowly improving, but I don't think it's a matter of international neglect and one versus the other. I would completely echo Jeremy's point that in both cases we need a more systematically coordinated research response, which isn't just virology or modelling, what I do, or analysis, but is actually focused around how do we learn clinical lessons as quickly as possible.
So let me ask all of you about that, because there was a discussion about flu recently, and when we have another pandemic we should be doing randomised controlled trials of the best treatments and whether Tamiflu works or not. And my memory of the 2009 pandemic, and we were lucky it was mild, was everyone was working flat out and there was no way to do a randomised controlled trial. But are there ways that we could use routine collected data and different models and ways of doing it to try and get the answers so that we don't have to do randomised controlled trials that'll fall apart?
I mean, we are doing what we can, and I think observational data, particularly if it's captured in real time with greater accuracy, it doesn't have the gold standard of demonstrating causality between intervention and effect, but it is getting us part of the way. We're busy trying to dive into the data, which is partial, about what has been working on the ground in different districts. Can you link it? The data for Ebola, because of the nature of the situation, the nature of the societies affected and the level of infrastructure, is very, very partial. We could do much better here. But at the end of the day, if you can do a clinical trial, it has many benefits in terms of the quality of evidence, the timeliness, and cost, in terms of if a well-designed trial can answer questions which no other sort of study can, in a timescale that no other study can. But I think we need both.
Thank you. Question in the second row here. You've got one there. Yep.
James Wakely, GP.
Yep.
You said something about children faring better than adults. in the lecture someone. Have we any idea why that is?
I should caveat there are two factors going on here. Children have been exposed less to this virus. So if you look at what proportion per 1,000 people in an age group got infected during this epidemic, children, by which I mean infants all the way up to about age 20, have had lower infection rates. That probably reflects social structures, who cares for victims, the nature of transmission. On top of that, and this is work coming out quite soon, we've seen a more interesting pattern in terms of lethality, that the very young have a high death rate, as you might anticipate, and then people between about the age of about 10 and 20 have a much lower death rate, much better survival, and then gradually as you get older and older you have a worse outcome. We don't know the reasons for that at all, and I would pass over to my clinical colleagues over there to explain, to speculate.
We can't answer those questions because we haven't done the critical research that would allow you to answer them.
Thank you. Question in the second row. Yeah?
My name is Mike. I'm dead, sorry. My name is Mike. I'm interested because a young friend of mine is a Red Cross nurse in Sierra Leone doing work for this at the moment. Place beginning with K and I can't remember it. And my question is really, I'm getting more information from you, the panel here, than I've ever done from the press. And can you tell me which way the press helps and hinders the effort here from UK? Because all we hear about is one person coming back from there, being affected, going to Glasgow, and that's about it.
So let me start by saying a big thank you on behalf of everyone, not just the British, but actually the people of West Africa, for those volunteers who've gone out. Public health, laboratory, nursing, clinical, managerial, army, a mass of people have volunteered, put their own lives on the line and done a fabulous, absolutely wonderful job. Do you want to talk to the press? Yeah.
I'll say a couple of things about media. I think it's certainly the case that the national press in the UK, and indeed globally, has been far more interested in the very, very few cases that have happened in European or US populations than they have in what's going on in West Africa. And I think that's a reflection of, if you like, the power relations in our global world. In a way, what Ebola has slotted rather neatly into is something we've seen before in many other epidemics, a kind of global outbreak narrative whereby some nasty disease in some remote bit of Africa or Asia suddenly goes global and threatens the world, and that's when it becomes interesting to the media. And I think that's actually horrifying and something we should be arguing against. So all power to those journalists, and there have been quite a lot, who've been on the ground and attempting to report what they've seen. There has actually been quite a lot of very good investigative reporting. One has just had to hunt harder to find it because it hasn't always hit the front pages of our newspapers, but it has been there. So we've had international journalists from the BBC, from Reuters, from National Geographic, from others. We've had a lot of local reportage. Some of it has been problematic because it's perpetuated other myths. One that I was involved in trying to combat quite early on was this idea that Ebola is spread by bushmeat, and eating bushmeat, which played down the fact that it was already a human-to-human epidemic, and the media was suddenly being taken up by all these mythical ideas about the deforestation and people cutting down trees and bringing this epidemic upon themselves. So there have been some media myths that have needed quelling. But there has also been some quite good reportage. What needed to happen was for it to go international.
I'll just make one additional point, which is, and it's not always easy to get at these things, but this has been one instance where there's been fantastic coverage in the new media, in digital media. There have been excellent, not that technical, but dedicated sites with very factual, very up-to-date information. I'm very happy, and if you email me, then I'm very happy to point you in the right direction if you want, but it is one of those examples where if you know where to look, there's some fantastic information out there.
Thank you. At the back, let's go right to the back. There we are. Thank you.
Hi there. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. My name's Eddie Taylor. I'm a tour guide in London. You mentioned about Jon Snow in an 1854. I've Googled that, by the way, not general knowledge. He managed to get a water pump handle removed from Soho. He went against conventional wisdom of the time and against the government, kind of convinced them to actually get that removed. And in Sierra Leone, they still bury their dead whole. So what can you do to get them to cremate their dead, which they're doing in Liberia?
Melissa.
The cremation policy in Liberia is quite an interesting case. I think we still don't know how effective it's been because it's a safer way to get rid of dead bodies. On the other hand, it's also deeply feared, and there was certainly anecdotal evidence when that policy was introduced that it actually led to quite a lot of cases being hidden and going underground. And indeed, there was a pretty big black market for fake death certificates over several months as people sought to avoid having their relatives cremated in this kind of way. So I think it's one of the areas which, as Chris alluded to, we don't know actually what has bent these curves. I don't think it's going to become entirely clear that the cremation policy has helped in that respect. But I would say that cultural practices are always open to change and modification. It might take time, but I think the idea that somehow things are static, they're unchanging, you can't alter tradition, is really not the case. And we've seen a great deal of learning, even in Sierra Leone, about people modifying what they do about funerals, about altering the ways they wash and prepare bodies, about not having these big gatherings, about doing funeral rites in different ways. And cremation is, if you like, one further step. I think if it proves that that's a really important thing to do for infection control needs, if carefully and sensitively talked about, it might happen. I think the fundamental thing is that communication and policy needs to treat people as intelligent human beings who can think creatively about finding solutions. And on the whole, imposing messages top down or imposing blanket policies is not the way to bring about these modifications of behaviour. One needs to do it much more in a dialogical way. Listen, there's a problem here. We need to find a solution together.
Happens in this country too.
Indeed.
Anyone else at the back? There we are. Yes, it clearly pays to sit on the gangway.
Hi, I'm Rod Dubitsky with BRAC, NGO who has operations in both Liberia and Sierra Leone. We've talked about a big contribution to Ebola being lack of health infrastructure. Can the panel talk about the possible improved use of community health workers, both in terms of training, coordination, regulation, as stepping into the gap that will take perhaps decades to fill by trained medical professionals? Thank you.
Chris, do you want to just pick up on that?
I think that the question about how best to provide a health service where there's too few trained medical staff is a problem across Africa and indeed some parts of, significant parts actually, of Asia and Latin America. And I think there are probably three things just to, I would say on that. The first of which is it is important not to be bound by a model which starts off with doctors or even highly trained nurses. But at the same time, it's important not to go right down to the situation where you assume that anybody can do anything, because that also is clearly not true. So clearly you need to provide the best kind of training you can under the local circumstances. Specifically on those countries, I think one of the great things, there are positives that come out of these, and one of these is that many people have come into healthcare who previously were not in it, and I think have been attracted in and may stay in. But we're trying to work out a system to maintain that is not going to be at all straightforward. But I think the third thing I would say is that where health services provided by the public sector are poor or break down, the private sector invariably steps in some way or another. It may not be effective, it may just take people's money and make them live better or even make them worse. But the fact is that in most countries in Africa, for most poor people, it is the private sector, not meaning some buffoon in a pinstripe suit in Harley Street, but meaning someone who runs a small duka that sells paraffin and bicycle tyres and chloroquine tablets for malaria. That actually steps into the gap for poorer people. And I think we should not ignore that reality. We should engage with the private sector rather than just assuming it's something that just doesn't work. It is what most people go to.
Thank you. One last question over there.
Hello. Hi, I'm Erin Lafferty from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And my question concerns things said by two of the panelists. So one, Professor Ferguson, you said that Ebola is an RNA virus like flu and like HIV, but doesn't seem to be mutating the same way that they are. And then Professor Farr, you said that as we roll out these, there's new antivirals that are going to be rolled out. So my question around this is, do we fear that as we roll out these antiviral treatments, that there's going to be an increase in resistance or an increase in mutation rate in Ebola? And as we roll out these antiviral treatments, is someone monitoring this?
So Ebola mutates exactly like flu and HIV. But my point was, just because a virus mutates doesn't mean it's really evolving in the sense of changing its characteristics. But clearly, if we impose a strong selection pressure on the virus, Darwinian selection pressure by treating everybody, there would be a risk of resistance emerging. I mean, RNA viruses are very good at generating resistant variants. However, we're not really in a position to see whether that's actually going to be a problem at the current time. It's something we can anticipate, but it doesn't negate the need to actually have some sort of treatment.
Yeah. I mean, nothing to add to that, really. I think we sometimes, I mean, it is a worry and it would be inevitable at some point, but right now you'd be dearly love to have a treatment for which you could worry about resistance developing down the track. And of course, if we had two, we would wish to combine them and all the rest of it. So I think worrying about resistance at the moment would not put me off trying to push forward on trying to improve treatment.
Thank you. So I think you've been a great audience and it was a wonderful panel. So I want to thank you for joining us for this conversation, the panel for being fantastic, and the Royal Society for hosting it, because I think it's been a very good evening. Thank you to all of you.